All right. Well, hello, everybody. John Sviokla here, and I'm delighted to be accompanied with my dear friend and probably the smartest person I know, and I know a lot of smart people, Ellen Levy. It's a real treat. I think over the next hour or so, you're going to get a real education and an education of incredible value. The thing about Ellen that's kind of cool is it's rare that I've ever met somebody who has a combination of real intellectual genius, curiosity, practicality, and riskability. And then underlying the entire thing is a set of relationships that when Ellen tells you you know somebody, she's not like, hey, I could find them in my Rolodex. It's like they will take the call. Okay. They are always in if you're coming from Ellen. And I've just learned so much and had such fun with her over the years. And in addition to all this, if we want to be pecuniary for a minute, I don't have stats to prove this, but I wouldn't be surprised if she wasn't the best angel investor in the world, or certainly in the top 10. So she's got over 100 companies in her portfolio, and I'm going to illustrate like this notion of variety and practicality in a minute here when I ask her to tell you a story about cow belching. Okay, which is a thing that she's looking at right now. So Ellen, welcome.
Well, I'll say, you know what, it's been a treat over the years working with you, but you win the award for the most complimentary of my friends. So I hope I live up to half of that.
Well, that's just because I know you well. Okay. So we're in the middle of our this is our Growth Innovator series, and I do think it's true that Ellen is the most connected person in Silicon Valley. She's Silicon Valley Connect is the organization that she's created. Also, I'm going to ask her in a little bit to tell you her background in terms of how she got to be Chief Strategy Officer at LinkedIn, because it's a really important and interesting story. And part of the reason that as Ellen sees trends, she does interesting things to develop understanding before the wave hits, and then is there ready to do it. One of her PhD thesis actually is in cognitive psychology, looking at how people consume information. At the time, the movement from 2D to 3D presentation was a big part of that, and a lot of people were curious about it, and she looked at that. But her broader understanding of that topic is just unbelievable. So going through some of these introductions, we're going to talk from about a bunch of things that Ellen's invested in and curious about and helping with, because in addition to her investing and mentorship and leadership stuff that she does, she also is a very, very important part of what ASU, Arizona State University, is doing in terms of education and innovation, led by a fantastic leader by the name of Michael Crow, who is just a force of nature. And Ellen is really helping that organization a lot, has a lot of understanding of ed tech, and how it relates to some of her investments as well in terms of managing workforces, how to think about productivity, some of the things that are going on in terms of employee retention and the great resignation that we're in the middle of, where over 40 million Americans have left their jobs voluntarily. And then to talk about, essentially, how do you think about your network as a way to create innovation and innovation advantage. In addition, the chat area, please put any questions you have or so forth in the chat area. I will be monitoring that and try to get your questions in as we get into that. So, Ellen, I'd love you to start with just, how did you get to be Chief Strategy Officer at LinkedIn, and the project you're doing, and why they turned to you as that blogging software and LinkedIn started to happen, because I think that's instructive.
Yeah, it may sound a little more prescriptive than it actually was, but the short version is I ended up in the Bay Area to go to grad school, right? So I'd been out here, and immediately, even though I was sitting in my graduate program and doing my PhD, I was realizing what it meant to be in an entrepreneurial environment, fairly merit-based. So if you had a good idea and you wanted to run with it, you could. And so when I came out of grad school, I did a year as a stint as effectively the chief of staff to one of the executives at Apple. But as I was there, I met a bunch of folks. Again, this network theme we'll probably get to later. And one of them eventually went off to be the CEO of one of the internet startups that was coming out of this Web 1.0 era. This is right mid 90s. And you're starting to see the wave. And if you remember Web 1.0, email homepages and directories are what made the thing go. Like those were the big drivers, is how do we even connect up on the web and find other people. And so he ran one of those startups, and he had been the head of the PowerBook division and said, come work with me. So within a year of finishing grad school, I'm now pulled into the internet experience right as the consumer internet's blossoming. Did that for a while. Went to a second, my company was acquired by one of the big search engines at the time, and then got pulled in by another former Apple exec who was on the board of a startup to do ebooks. So think like the Kindle, but 20 years ago. We had all the components, we had all the vision, and that also got acquired within a year of me going there. And so the reason I tell you that is while this was all happening, we're getting close to 99. And as you'll remember, internet bubble, which all of a sudden burst in 2000. But in 99, I had this crazy idea for a bunch of reasons we could get into that I would chronicle my entire life for a year. I just thought, how fascinating if you write down everything. And I had made simple rules for myself. I said, I have to write everything. I can't go modify it after the fact. I can't decide what's important, which was the try to write everything part. I can't say, oh, this is critical and this is trivial, and try to take a picture of everyone I meet. And this is getting to your question about LinkedIn. And so I spent the entire year of 99 documenting my life. And again, I didn't have like this grand plan, and then I was going to take this corpus and do X and do Y with it. But it did a couple of things in hindsight that were really, really interesting and set me up. One of which was it just made it acutely aware of time. But the way my mind worked, the whole thing organized as if I was writing a story or a play and I was doing character development. So if I mentioned you and doing this podcast today, if I were doing it today, I'd have to go back to when I first met you. And then we, when you were at Diamond, and then you were at Price Waterhouse, but then I looked up your stuff when you taught at Harvard. And then so I would be filling in these stories of people all the time, right? Like that was just the way I learned to capture everything. And so two things. One, I had developed almost a psychological disorder tracking people, right? Unintentionally, but that's what I was doing. The second is I like to kind of shorthand it and say it was the manual version of how hard it was to keep track of people and connections and things that set you up to have an awareness of why Web 2.0 was going to matter.
Right.
So like I'd have to write down everything about somebody, but when you look at LinkedIn, for example, where I ended up working, all the stuff I was writing down when I met somebody at a cocktail reception now existed already. I didn't have to say, oh, he was a professor at Harvard. Oh, he did. It would already be there, and I could capture some of the more nuanced stuff. And so along the way, I'd gotten to know Reid Hoffman kind of in the business circles of people who were really pushing the envelope on consumer internet. And so I think those things and our interactions meant that when he was thinking of starting LinkedIn, he came and talked to me and said, would you like to be an advisor? And so in the early days, I actually pulled a lot on like what I wish had existed. And it wasn't just LinkedIn. I had, people like when Flickr was getting started, one of the founders came and said, would you like to throw all your photos up on our site? There were companies that didn't talk to me, but I had realized what would be interesting. Like if you think about the company TimeHop that came along, it would show you 4 years later the photos that you had posted, right? Or things like that. Well, people wanted me to do the equivalent of a time hop. Like, hey, you did that journal in 99. Now it's 2003. How about you give snippets of what was happening? And the people starting blogging sites were like, you were the first blogger. And honestly, I wasn't. It's just that there were no priors. And so I look, nobody read my journal. So I was definitely not the first blogger. It was not for consumption. But it gave me a sense of how hard is it to capture the information, what matters, how do you manage your time, how do you show that you've connected with somebody when you don't have a lot of time, and those things all came to play.
That's wild. You're like the Marcus Aurelius of the blogging world. Yeah. Anyway, he didn't expect this thing to be right either. That's I understand. Yeah. That's a riot. Yeah, you were featured in a Wall Street Journal article or something like that as well, weren't you?
Yeah. Again, I mean, we've got some time. I'll give you the fast anecdote on that one. When you think about stuff that you work on and people you meet, you don't know what's the most consequential. So a little bit about letting serendipity happen, a little bit about getting yourself in the right place, and also just, things happen in interesting, lucky ways. This Wall Street Journal story came about, the 30-second version, on a flight between San Francisco and New York, which happened all the time back, traveling around doing business. I sat next to a guy who I was in the ebook business at the time, and he was in the magazine business. So we hit up a conversation. And as I would do for every conversation halfway through the flight, I'd say, do you mind if I get the flight attendant to take our picture? Because I'm chronicling my life for a year. And so he'd be like, sure. Flight attendant takes a picture. And then for the next 10 minutes, we talk about what is this crazy thing I'm doing?
Yes.
Get the business card, because I get everybody's business cards so that I could keep track of their names. And I never see the guy again.
Right.
6 months to the day after I sat next to that guy on an airplane, my story runs on that crazy person column on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And what basically happened, and I was able to go and figure out how it got there because of my chronicling. The guy went home, told a colleague, the colleague told a friend, and the friend told this woman at a party in New York City. She was an up-and-coming journalist at the Wall Street Journal who covered Latin America at the time, but she's like, human interest story. Let me hunt this down. And then all of a sudden I get this random phone call on my voicemail at work at a startup saying, I hear you're doing a real-time autobiography, right? And again, I have it all documented starting with that voicemail where I thought my friends were spoofing me, right? Like I thought they were making fun of me.
Sure.
And there you go. And it turned out to be the most consequential single thing that happened in that year. Because for the last quarter of the year, I was documenting what happens when you get written up in the middle of the Wall Street Journal, right? Like crazy stuff all over the place. So.
That's right. Yeah, I didn't know that last detail about the connection with the up and coming reporter. That's cool.
Yep.
That's great. So let's get into in terms of what you're seeing for the future of work, the advancing of technology, the development of people, that whole area that you know so much about and have so many interesting investments in. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I often say I'm focused on future work, and I do it intentionally. Usually I hate these kind of buzzword phrases that really it's like a Rorschach test and everybody can see in it what they want. But I like that people can see what they want in it because I think it is such a broad sentiment around work and people being able to support themselves and feel like they've achieved something. And what I also like is that it's so broad now that at least in my opinion, it encompasses everything from ed tech, right? Like if you want to be able to work, how do you start learning what you need to enter the workforce? How do you reskill yourself now that you can't rely on one set of training that will take you through the rest of your career without doing any refresh or even a pivot? And so there's that aspect, which is what do people learn? How frequently do they update what they know? And then there's a whole nother dimension, which is why do people work and how do we make it good environments? And do they need to be physically present? And is there a social component that was, as it turns out, equally important, if not more important to people than the actual work they were doing? And so it just gives a nice broad umbrella where, at least for the things I try to focus on, I just like at the end of the day to say, I like what the outcomes mean, right? I like that people can get work, they can contribute to society, they can support their families, they can have good mental health in the process. And so it leaves it open to a lot of interpretation under that kind of umbrella.
Gotcha. And so what are some of the more interesting startups like Betterment? I know is one that you're
Better Up, yeah.
Better Up, sorry, not Betterment. Yeah.
Betterment's a good company too, but I'm in Better Up.
Yeah, could you just describe kind of like what, both what they do, how did you happen to, get connected with them?
Sure. Well, I invested in the company and went on their advisory board right when they were getting started. So this is, I don't know, 8 years ago. And I don't claim to keep track of all the details and nuances of what they're doing today, but basic idea was, look, people often find ways to improve themselves, especially the metaphor of like when you're training as an athlete. You can be a professional athlete, or you can be sitting here saying, I just want to get in good shape. I want to lose some pounds. I want to fend off pre-diabetes, whatever it is. You can get somebody to help coach you through those stages of bettering yourself. But why don't we have something at a grand scale that lets you do that when you're thinking about your professional life, right? And so Better Up said, look, let's start by thinking about how do we create a career coaching model which democratizes access. That kind of common theme that people start saying is a lot of the ways that internet changed things is it made stuff that was expensive and rare and only for a handful of people accessible to many. And in this case, it was about how do you access a good career coach who can help you think through things.
Yes.
At whatever stage you're at, it's that next step that you want to take. And then what's amazing about it is with that broad vision, you can start to say, well, if I'm thinking about being a better performer in the workplace, I might be thinking about my interpersonal skills. I might be talking about kind of the way you position yourself and sample different functional roles in a company to one day want to be a CEO, whatever the version of bettering myself. But it also meant you could include things like mental health and well-being,
Mhm.
right? There's no rigid kind of, I will just do these things. It was really looking at an individual and saying, how can they improve themselves in this context? And it becomes a holistic way of helping folks.
Yeah.
And at this point, I'm so excited about Better Up. They're doing it in such a broad way. It became a platform, in my opinion, that's wildly important, especially as you go through these huge disruptions and issues you didn't see coming, like a pandemic.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But the principles and the value proposition, not only did they persist, they became that much more poignant. And so that's when we're seeing it early. I love that they start thinking about the individual first, but they
Yes.
can build a platform and marketplace at scale, and then they can adjust to the specific needs of the times under the same kind of true north.
Yeah. So you really look for that kind of fundamental need, good for society, mega scale,
Yep.
as you say, democratization of an important, expensive commodity down
And
to.
as you're going to hear, right, with LinkedIn, with Better Up, I love when they can start by thinking about the individual, right? And so, like, my experience with Better Up and a coach may be very different than somebody else's, but the platform starts with the individual and then cultivates an experience that helps you along. And I think we're going to later talk about it. I see that coming in ed tech as well, right? How do you
Yes.
start with the individuals?
Yeah, I know this may sound odd, but I think it might go nicely here. Could you tell the story about the cow burps and your interest in that, just so people can see how you generally think about stuff, even in a very
I was going to say, I'm not sure how that ties into thinking about the
well,
individuals. I am thinking
to me, it's how you look at an opportunity because I think
I'm thinking
in
about
there,
cows, yes, as
yeah,
well. So no, it's fun. I'm looking at a company now that I think is super intriguing. And the short version is a lot of us have heard about how do we, climate, paying attention to climate and startups that are trying to address climate issues. Methane gas, huge issue wherever you have emissions. And one of the ways you find emission, or one of the places you find significant emissions is in with cattle. What I didn't know is that a big piece of that is burping, right? Apparently, something about the digestion process for cows means they burp out methane. And this company has figured out a way to take kelp and turn it into a product that can be put in feed of cows and reduce methane gas emissions. And the business model is intriguing for how it can be a win for everybody. You can be helping the farmers. You can actually be helping, climate. You can be doing a bunch of things all at the same time. And so, it's just that's an example, again, not about individuals first, because that would be me extending it to cows, but more about I love finding issues where people are taking on a big problem. They find a very specific way to go after it, and like if they keep getting their next step right, it could be bigger and bigger and bigger.
yeah,
But with a value proposition that holds throughout, right? Like at LinkedIn, we always said, look, we want to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful. And our vision was that if we do that, that was our mission. You bring economic opportunity, right? And so, if you sit there and go, I could do a great business with cows and agriculture and changing that. But you know what? I'm chipping away at methane gas emissions when we all should be focusing somehow on what's our little part to play when
right.
there's climate as a big issue.
Yeah, I just love the way that great higher purpose, scalability, and then you see visibility to what are the stages to get there and how does that opportunity open
And
kind
then
of
the piece I didn't add, but you just rattled off all the things I like about my day job today. But the extra piece I'd add, and then you just find these inspired entrepreneurs, right?
yes,
Listening to folks like the founders, Alexi and Eddie for Better Up, or the founder of this cow burping company, as I call it. They're just inspired, right? They're smart. They know what they want to go after. They absorb new information like there's no tomorrow, so that they're always ready to adjust and just keep going forward. And I figure like I get to live vicariously through them in a lot of the ways that I invest.
sure. No, that's amazing, and I've seen you do it, and it's phenomenal. Yeah. So as you think about, I mean, let's turn to ed tech, and
Yeah.
because I'm not saying anything out of school because he said it publicly. Mike Crow over at ASU, he really believes if we don't democratize education, especially higher ed, it's going to be pitchforks in the streets, right? It's revolution time. I mean, I'm haunted. I want to know what Bezos said, but I'm haunted by that report by Jon Stewart where he was having dinner with Obama and Jeff Bezos, and Bezos talked about his vision of the future, and according to Stewart's report, Stewart said, "Well, if the future goes that way, that's a formula for revolution." And Obama agreed with him. He said, "Yeah, Stewart's right. That's a formula for revolution." So, and interesting, yeah.
Well, as you've heard before, I am such a super fan of Arizona State University and what they're doing. And this is not, I went to Michigan undergrad and Stanford grad school, and often now people are confusing me with having gone to ASU, which I wish I had in many ways. But
you had the right shirt on for it, I think.
This is not about like picking a university you're going to cheer for in the classic sense of like their sports teams and the alumni network. Right. This is about a university where the president went in roughly almost 20 years ago with a very clear vision, right? That if you think about the role of the public university, if we can't count on our public universities to educate the public at large, who will? And I think it's pretty accepted statement to say that education is a transformative experience. It changes the trajectory of people's lives for the better. And accessing good quality education is not only important, but it's also gotten harder, more expensive, more exclusive. And so when President Crow, best of my understanding, but this is pretty straightforward, when he went in, he said, how can I take a university, make sure we're making it available to as many people as possible in an affordable way, and also take into consideration the outcomes, like not just how many did we enroll and what was their GPA, so that we're getting only the people that are the best and the brightest by scores or by grades, but like, how can we take anybody who we think is capable of going through a college experience, get them through, and then measure that we've had an impact on their lives and the communities that they go into. And so the interesting thing is, and this is true for a bunch of businesses I look at now, so the blurring of like, I'm talking about a university, but it applies for companies. If you want to scale and get bigger, and you want to at least maintain, if not improve quality, the thesis 20 years ago for President Crow was you have to think about technology as a tool, as a way of getting leverage. Because otherwise what happens oftentimes is you scale and you kind of go down to a lowest common denominator, or it gets diluted. But with technology, he saw that he could make it so that I could get higher quality, bring in lots more students. And it was an access issue, not I'm bigger than the next university issue. And let technology start driving those ways that we can bring education to as many people in a quality way. And the repercussions of him having thought about that so deeply even 20 years ago means that the university has just been doing, I think it's the 7th year now they've been named the most innovative university in the country by US News and World Report. And I have to look at those and say, oh yeah, esoteric study. But so my understanding, you'd have to double check me on this, is that's by polling his peers. That's by polling presidents and provosts, et cetera. So I think the hardest thing for ASU is that people don't understand what's going on there. I think anybody I've ever taken to go look under the hood, it's like a microcosm on society, whether you look and say that they now have a student body that kind of mirrors society, whether you're looking at the number of people who are first in their family to go to college, or coming from families below the poverty line, or pick any metric. I've been told by a former Secretary of Veterans Affairs, one of the best universities in the country for supporting our veterans. Like, I can go on, and yet if you simply look at academic measures, those are going up as well. Graduation rate and Fulbright scholars, and you just list goes on and on. And the last thing I'll say on my little soapbox for ASU, because as you could tell, I just think people don't understand how incredibly unique this university is. If I put my Silicon Valley hat on, forget that I also love universities and the role that they can play in the world. And I say, look, what happens with startups? We all say, look, we love startups because you get these entrepreneurs that can focus on something where a lot of people think it can't be done. Other businesses would be undermining their own business, so they don't do it. And they're scrappy and they go after something new. Once you accomplish that, what do you hear, right? And I'll point to Reid Hoffman, who I know well. It's all about scaling.
Right.
Once you've figured those things out, now you want to get big. But remember, at the beginning, when I started these startups, I was railing on the big guys. They don't get it. They're slow. They're cumbersome. They're locked in their ways. So if you think of a 2x2, how entrepreneurial and innovative can I be and how big am I? You usually say that you can be small and entrepreneurial or big and encumbered and slow moving. So if you find people in that upper right quadrant, right, who are big and innovative and entrepreneurial and resourceful, that's a pretty, I mean, that's a rare club, rarefied air, I was going to say, and you look at it and you say, who does that, right? There's a handful of companies.
Right.
Well, I'd say if you think about organizations, not companies, you would put ASU in that corner with the likes of the Amazons and the Googles, and like it's there's not that many that have done it at scale.
And then if you do a little Venn diagram inside there, and you and I've talked about this from my billionaire book, and then you say organizations that are no longer led by the founder, right? Because Dr. Crow had to go into an existing institution, right? He didn't found the place.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know even how you'd think about that with universities, right? Because they've been along for such a long time. And what he knew is he knew that I think he'd thought through like any number of public universities had the good structure you'd want to then leverage up to make it even more potent as a value proposition in society. And so, yes, he was able to come in and do that. And
it's amazing.
He's a force of nature.
Yes.
He is one of those people that I would follow off a cliff if I had to, because his vision's so clear and his purpose is so clear, and yet he can check the boxes he needs to check. I mean, if all I did was measure him on what he's doing for the students in Arizona who have access to the public university in their state, phenomenal. But if I look around the world and see what he's done for refugees who need to get education in a unique way, because there's only a couple ways to get it to them, he's delivering on that too. And so he's created this ecosystem where everything you need to measure, if somebody only cares about one thing, it's going up and to the right. And yet putting a complex system together is just masterfully well done there. And it's incredibly hard. I think it's the hardest thing that people do is when you get to that level of kind of doing a microcosm on a complex system.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So turning to more to like, what are the kinds of things you're seeing in ed tech that you think are interesting, and why do you think they're interesting?
Yeah, well, so again, the way that, like, if I look at LinkedIn, and one of our early insights was, or theses that worked, was we just said, look, we think the trend for people staying in one job shorter and shorter amount of time means everyone will eventually need to be their own small business.
Right.
I run Silicon Valley Connect, as you mentioned. It is an LLC with one employee. So now I have to do my own marketing. I like, how do people know that I'm reputable? How do they find me? So now I have to do things that it used to be I'd get from my big company.
Right.
The move to your question about education, how do I make it so individuals can access it? Right? Like in the last decade, I've really started to think, look, we grew up in an era where we specialized, right? Like, this industrial age specialization, I'll do this really well, and then you go put 4 people after me who do their piece as well, and then when that chain is put together, we get great stuff. But with specialization, we had to stitch everything together, and what it meant was that the fixed variable is what I do, right? And the dependent variable is whether it's good for somebody. And that's like, who has to absorb variability is my generic concept. And I should say more because it's sounding a little cryptic as I listen to myself. What it means is, like, companies say, I'm going to make a product and I hope you're going to buy it. That's kind of the old way of thinking about it. The new way is, you take a shoe company, I think it's Nike. You can go and basically customize all these variables on the shoe you want, and it's an N of 1 that they can produce and drop to your house. Not a pallet to a centralized distribution center that goes out to a bunch of stores and I go look at the 5 colors and sizes and see if there's one for me. I can get what they've done in products, for example, in the business world, is starting to tune it so that I'm the fixed variable. What I want is the fixed thing, and the businesses have to get good at figuring out how to manage variability, whether it's the shipping and logistics, the design, the production, so that it's cost effective to create things as one-offs. We'll now go to education. If you think about who should absorb variability, we're going to look back and say, why is it that we think that you sit your butt in a chair for a certain number of hours over the course of a certain number of years and you're done? Like, the fixed variable is how many hours in a chair in a location. No, it should be that I learned something, however I best learn, and through whatever mechanisms over what period of time. And so what I think of education all comes down to that, which is we are seeing a massive shift where people are now probing at, Can I, ASU is an example, but there's tons of startups, can I go figure out a couple classes where if you take them, it's
Yeah.
a very good predictor that you are capable of completing a college degree. And if so, do I care what your high school grades were? Maybe you had other things going on in your life that made it hard for you to complete high school, or the first time you went to college and had to drop out, it was because of, family members' health issues, not because of competency. How do I get to the point where the point is, am I capable? And if I am, how do I give you what you need so that you can then be educated, learn something new that you can put to work in many ways? And
Sure.
so I think education, you're seeing stuff around delivery, types of content, peer-to-peer tutoring. I mean, all kinds of ways of unleashing this once you say that it doesn't have to fit this one size fits all, and we're going to measure some of the old metrics.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. You know, Brett in our chat was saying that, from economies of scale to economies of precision,
Yeah.
which, I think is cool. It kind of
Well, and
resonates.
you mentioned the chat. I see somebody, Punita Gandhi,
Yeah.
mentions what if we apply this fixed and dependent variable to workplace? Absolutely. In the HR world now, some of the innovations that I love. I mean, it's not the only ones. And again, I kind of anecdotally sample, but this idea that you bring in talent and you put a role around them. Right.
Mhm.
And we've seen hints of that for a while. Remember when Google, it was a novelty that Google would say engineers can take 20% of their time to do whatever they want. How do you optimize around the resources you have? And as a company, an HR group, for example,
Mhm.
figure out how to manage that, right? Like in a perfect world, maybe you go, I'm getting the absolute most out of everybody, even though the role didn't quite say that it's not that I'm going out of my lane. I'm doing something I'm really good at over here, but how do you manage that? What if it
Mhm.
wasn't in my OKRs, but I was the single most qualified person in the company to do it? Doesn't the company want that done? Like if it's critical,
Yeah.
but how do we create systems that capture the notion that there's value in that? And so that variability and how you manage to it, I think, is the crux of the workplace, of education. It's going to come out in healthcare. We're going to look back and say, isn't it crazy that we all took the same aspirin tablet every, same time of day, like this notion that my body will respond the same way as your body. And we're seeing it coming. It's how do you do it at scale, economically, thoughtfully, so that you don't leave some people behind? Like it's great if you get 80% of the people who you can be precise for, but what about the 20% that there's no economic incentive? And so trying to keep all those in place, while it all in my head, it all for some crazy reason comes down to, if businesses and schools and healthcare providers can somehow figure out how to take on more of that variability so
Yeah.
that we map to the individuals more thoughtfully, we're going to see huge innovation.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting because if you go back in the, traditional economies of scale and scope, and then you look at, there's really some amazing work done at Harvard Business School back in the late 70s, early 80s that looked at basically different production types and where were the binding points in production scale. Like if you're an oil refinery or a paint manufacturer or a housing builder, right? And they're very different. And this guy came up with an architecture of production types that had different scale factors. And when you have to make binding decisions as to, like, for example, paint is very late. Like I can late mix paint. So I just, get a number of base paints and then I add, right? Compared to building a dam, right? I have to make all kinds of, design decisions even before the concrete's poured, right? So it's not late binding at all. It's very early binding. And then what are the economies of scale if you can change that stuff? And you look at Amazon, for example, filed a patent, I think about 2 years ago, that was, and I might get some of this wrong, but anyway, this is my memory of it. Where basically they were shipping a non-committed inventory into a probabilistic demand cloud. And that to me is a version of what you're talking about. It's like,
Yep.
okay, I'm just moving that inventory in space and time, which
Yep.
will then bind later,
Yep.
right? And it's a totally different way to think
Well,
about.
and it's funny again. I don't want to get it too academic in it, but when I love probability and stats, and I taught it a lot in grad school. And I think one of the challenges when you start talking about variability is you are talking about playing off of probabilities versus,
Right.
right? Like remember in the old days, I always use this simple example. If you call a plumber to your house to fix your toilet, they either fixed it or they didn't, right? Like it's a did they do their job or did they not do their job?
Right. Yeah.
But in the world we're talking about, somebody can come, do all things right, and there is a chance that the bad or the undesired outcome happens.
Sure.
That doesn't mean they didn't do their job well. It didn't mean that the company, and so we're going to have to start to figure out ways of making sure people understand that because we got a bad outcome doesn't mean somebody did something bad. It
Right.
doesn't rule it out,
Right.
but it means that there are times where we're working off a probabilistic model, which
Right.
says by definition that sometimes you will get that tail of the distribution you didn't want, the
Right.
very, extreme
Yeah.
version. Whether that's you try to help all employees, but somebody gets caught, and it's going to mean figuring out. We always say in shorthand, intent, right? Like it matters what your intent was. In this case, what rules I put in place, what programs I put in place, those are probably going to have that same characteristic, which is a well-designed program, but at the edges you may see things that don't work. It doesn't mean that the company didn't care. It doesn't mean that the provider didn't care, but we have to figure out how to get people to realize what happens out of probabilistic systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see it in healthcare with the accountable care organizations and so forth, right? Because when you're down at the individual level, you can have all
Yep.
kinds of variability, right? But
Yep.
you can, whatever. No, it's really interesting. And then I think where what the new economies of scale are very different. You know what I mean? Because usually information scale is massively scalable, not always, but usually.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you see it in newspapers, right?
Yeah.
Google's the sum of what, 5,000 newspapers, right? And all in one company, right?
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, yeah.
Well, I'm intrigued by also just things that have come along in waves. And again, I don't study the market, so I just am more telling you the anecdotes I've pulled out that I find intriguing and kind of philosophical ways for what's happening. But stuff that lets people innovate where it was cost prohibitive or some kind of resource prohibitive before. And if you look at what things like Kickstarter did to let
sure,
people start innovating in hardware, like it'd be a hard bet for a lot of people before something like a Kickstarter came along to go and say, I'm going to build something that's expensive and costly, and before I know if people want it.
right,
Right. So you could test demand before and so all of a sudden you can have innovation in hardware areas where you couldn't before. And then of course there's outsourced manufacturing, and there's all these the pick, pack, and ship people who definitely so there were lots of things that came along that opened it up. And I was just having this conversation with somebody the other day. I'm hoping to have more because I'm just getting up to speed on some of this climate stuff. What's happening in the world of climate, environment, sustainability that
right.
makes it so more people can rush in and start trying to innovate, where those prohibitive pieces have kind of been either you're flanked by resources that let you get there, or you can have it be leveraged across a bunch of efforts. And I think it's coming, but seeing how people break those open and
Sure.
let you scale is going to be a really interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're thinking about stuff like, I mean, when you take a look at power, having a descaling of power and bidirectionality as opposed to hierarchical from the what's that old joke about Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell both go to sleep for 100 years, and Bell wakes up and says, "Wow, look at the innovations," and Edison wakes up and says, "Looks pretty much the same way I left it." The I mean, true enough, right? But I think we're gonna have the internet of power and then water, and I think food's going to be interesting. Food's not
Yeah.
scaling as quickly, but so on. Could we just dive in a little bit on Punita? Punita's full disclosure. Punita's a dear friend and brilliant woman. Anyway, I could you just kind of talk a little bit about taking the employee as the fixed thing, because organizations need to get stuff done. We have labor contracts. I've hired you to do X, blah blah blah. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard problem in the sense that I am a firm believer that things that get measured are what people play towards. And if you're compensating on the things that measured and things that aren't measured don't matter, like all those sayings that you hear. But at the same time, I think everybody who's looking at this thoughtfully feels the pain when they know there's something else that could be done and somebody else could do it, but you're breaking ranks, right? Like you're going to cause problems because now you're opening up for people to go rogue and do their own thing. And so just this innovation on how you pool everything your talent has to offer. And when I say that, it sounds like I'm thinking the company is optimizing what it sucks out of its people. No, because I actually also believe from the individual standpoint, there's not a lot more gratifying for somebody who's in a job that they care about, right? Like if it's just a paycheck and you hate the job no matter what, like I'm not sure I can change it much. I think I can some, but for the people who are in a company they believe in with something they like working on, letting you do something you're really good at, and actually whether you're the hero or you're uniquely contributing your skills, there's
Mhm.
something about being in that role that matters. And it kind of doesn't matter if I was hired in to do that, if in the moment I see I can jump in, be a team player. And so I always talk about, look, if a company had a way of not only giving me credit for like OKR, KPI checklist, I did what I was asked to do. But if there was like a second order checklist, I
Right.
did things that you didn't know I was going to do and I wasn't officially on the hook to do, but I did. Like imagine, I'll make up some silly little ones. Imagine if you could poll every employee and say, name 10 people who have helped you get this huge project done, critical to the company, who aren't on the team.
Right.
Right. And all of a sudden, what if you discovered that there were two people that appeared on everybody's lists? And again, getting back to connecting, those are often people who like to be connectors, who like to, or who are polymaths and just like doing a lot of stuff well. But what do you do with those people when you discover that in a company? Most companies wouldn't have a role for that.
Yeah.
Right? You play it out, you go, I pulled the 10 most critical projects in the company, and I ask everybody to do that. You know, the company's got a couple thousand employees, and two people appear on every list.
Yeah.
Do you take them out and make that their full-time job? Who's heard of a role like that? Like, I think there's a lot we can push on, and it's a delicate balancing act because you need to count on them to do the job they're in.
Yes.
And you don't know if they're doing it because they just only want to do what they want to do, or whether it's a skill that you could sit and optimize for, they'd be happy and the company would benefit, right? So those are the kind of balances that I think people need to think about. But I think if you think about like, I think in the context of latent potential in a company, there's a
Yes.
lot of latent potential not being released because of the structures we create, and we create them for good reason. But if people can figure out how to unleash some of that, there's real opportunity.
Well, what's interesting too, like the tone of the organization when you, and I'm sure you're familiar with Adam Grant's work on this about givers, takers, and matchers.
Yeah.
I mean, I love his work where, and I think at the aggregate, at the population level or whatever, his sample level, he's finding the same thing, which is people who are extreme givers, right, generally
Yeah.
don't perform well. But you want to balance, it needs some balance. You need to balance in aggregate and at the individual level. But those organizations more innovative grow faster, the whole routine, rather than matchers or takers as a predominant tone, if you
Yeah.
will. That's
Yeah.
just, yeah, I mean, amazing stuff. Yeah, the
Well, what I love in that example and a bunch of the others, and I'm seeing it with some of the HR folks that I've worked with for decades, HR is getting really thoughtful in a lot of instances about how do you see people for what they are and what the talents they have, and how do you bring them out? And it's the same with education. If you look at a student who had, was in college for a year, had a failing, like an F GPA,
yeah,
and wants to come back to school, ASU will dig in and go like, okay, so can they take these three courses, which we know predict that you're capable? And what happened? Oh, you dropped out because your, grandmother died and that was who was raising you and you had to go help raise your brothers and sisters. Like, don't you think that person should be in there? It's this, again, the continuum between education and some of the innovation, what we're seeing in the workplace is all one and the same to me. But how do you look at that person?
mhm.
I think the top HR folks are pushing on this hard.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I'm going to ask you in just a minute what of the startups that you're aware of or invested in that are doing some interesting things. But just before getting there, it's interesting. I did a study with a large investment bank, very successful one, and they did a version of this on client development, which is they would poll. They had four roles, and they said, okay, who played these roles in this account, and they would reward. They would reward accordingly, and they would penalize people who should be connectors, who are doers, most on the doer level, because the connector level added more aggregate value. And they would, even though it's a small amount of the time, if they were the connectors that opened up the account or built a relationship or made a critical,
Yeah.
linkage. And they actually did that when they did, and it moved comp quite a bit. And just one other, on a personal basis, at Diamond, where it was before PwC and Manifold, I remember went through this whole thing where we tried to get everything into little boxes about compensation. This amount of chargeability, blah, 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 here's the formula. This is what you're going to get, because we had a COO who wanted to push that. At the end of the day, you still have to make a judgment. And in that business, it is so important to do exactly what you just said, Ellen, which is make the biggest contribution for the client and for the whole. And so what we did is we backed off all those things and we just said, okay, here's the range, if you're way out of range one way or another. And then we compensated on impact. And we always we asserted just, look, this is judgment. We will poll your peers, the whole routine, but we refuse to go back formulaic because you just, it's as you say, it's a balance. I mean, you have to, Bob Eccles and Dwight Crane wrote a book about investment banking. They called it loose, tight controls. So you have some visibility, what do you do on your time, but then loose stuff. Hey, that little thing you did or that commitment, that made a huge impact.
Well, I always joke, if this goes awry, it's like having a second grade soccer team, right? Everyone runs to the ball, no one covers the goal. And so it really is an art to figuring out what's motivating people. And when you find the people that are motivated well, just help leverage what they're wanting to do and help. And keep kind of the bumpers on for when it's going awry of what the company also needs. But I'm a big believer that there's a nice overlap between those two, that you can let a lot of your employees do what they are most comfortable and capable and skilled at doing, that they get most gratification out of, and still be within the bounds of what the company needs. Right.
Oh, it just reminded me for later on the climate stuff. You should look at Eccles' work. He's like the world's expert on sustainable reporting. He's over at Syed Business School now.
Very cool. Yeah, a lot of my angel investing, I just use it as an excuse to go dig into stuff that I don't know.
Sure.
And talk to smart friends like you who can fill me in on it pretty quickly. It's a great way to stay up on stuff.
So what are some of the companies that are doing interesting things in
EdTech? In EdTech, I mean, again, I've not in my investing, I've not said I will go invest in EdTech, right? Like I haven't done that. I just invested in a company that I think is fantastically interesting. The idea that you can bring synchronous, so live teachers into schools that may have teacher shortages or particular domain expertise shortages, so that kids whose schools can't provide everything that other schools can, for one reason or the other, whether it's budgeting or access or just who happens to live where and want to teach what, you can now access it. And then you start thinking about what are the other dynamics that these kids could have, so that you not just level the playing field, but optimize for everyone. And so that's a very cool one. And trying to think about how do you create community around it. So it's called Dexter. It's getting up and going, but I think fantastically interesting.
Yeah.
One that is kind of EdTech, but again, along the continuum of skills training and EdTech kind of blurring together. I just invested in a company that's doing cybersecurity training, skills development.
Sure.
And my understanding, again, I'm not the expert in this category, but my understanding is we either already have or are about to have a shortage in talent in cybersecurity, right?
Yes.
That shouldn't surprise anyone, of hundreds of thousands of positions. And yet, if you come out of programs where it's a certificate program, or you're in a community college, or even out of your universities, you may not be hired, right? And the interesting question is, why not? And this company is trying to fill the gap. Right. Yes. They're saying, how do we give you the training? And it may be some real world experience on real data or circumstances, so that all of a sudden your opportunity and where you can jump into jobs goes way up. And the interesting question, it's a young company, is where all can be deployed? Can it be deployed inside companies where they can take some of their current employees and put them through this so that they now have new skills they can contribute to the company? Do you go put it alongside a community college? Do you put it and embed it within a university so that you fill the gap? So the minute these people are trained, they're getting amazing jobs and contributing in a field that we're going to have a desperate need for years, right? And I think of all of those in the context of education.
Yes.
I'm a big fan of a bunch of them that are out there. I have nothing to do. I wish I had something to do with them. Like I think Guild Education and the like, ASU has a company called InStride, like those companies trying to make access to education affordable and letting other people in the food chain, like in the case of Guild Education and InStride, letting employers help pay for employees to go get some additional college credits and college degrees. Starbucks went with ASU and said, we're going to make it so that our baristas can go get a college degree if they want through ASU provisioning. So there's a bunch of those. Again, I'm probably not the best person to say, here's the market map and here are the 3 that are the best. But I'm liking those that are figuring out how do you get really good teachers and really good content in front of students.
Yes.
How do we understand that sometimes it's not about the materials alone? Like, at ASU, they did some tests for the people that do full degrees online with them. And my understanding is when they looked at the students who showed up day 1 of an online class, what was the best predictor of whether they would complete the class? Like what one intervention might make the biggest difference? It was helping those folks figure out time management. It was some consulting on time management. It wasn't you need remedial math before you can pass. No, those may be there also, but looking holistically at the people involved. And a lot of startups are trying to figure out how to build those pieces that weren't even considered education into the mix.
Fascinating. Yeah. I mean, I think this whole notion of knowledge and skill together. I mean, I know when I was teaching, we talked a lot about it at Harvard Business School because of the case method is, it's a management simulator, right? You're doing an analysis, you're presenting it, you're discussing it in the context of a giant meeting, right? All these meeting skills and a bunch of other stuff that, really are whatever, more kind of reflexes than thinking, what I mean? And that, as you say, with the cybersecurity and so forth, to be able to blend that. I mean, in a weird way, it's kind of like, redoing guilds, becoming a silversmith, right? But doing it in a digital way.
But to make it clear how broadly I think of this education phenomenon, and part of the reason I say this is I think ed tech for quite a while now, maybe you could argue even up until the pandemic hit, was seen as like a cute niche vertical.
Right.
And there are some folks who've invested in it and they've done well, and there's been some good companies, but it was considered pretty niche. And even when you wanted to invest in something, you couldn't quite see how they were going to make it a big business.
Right.
And that's changed. But also the idea this education stuff is everywhere. Like I'll give an example. I'm on the board of a company called CAIS, CAIS. And it's a place that maps or matches up alternative asset managers with registered investment advisors. So how can these investment advisors find out about alternative asset classes that their clients might want to be in on and actually be able to invest in those when those asset managers are raising funds? But what's really interesting is that if you take a more holistic view, they've also created a program called Case IQ, which is an informational, educational part of the company's offering, the platform. So you can go learn about these new asset classes. Now, asset class, like alternative assets, sounds like a generic financial term, but like, what does that mean when you want to go learn about cryptocurrencies? Or what does it mean? And how do you start to say education and having people be well informed in what they do is something that like everybody's going to have to think about. And so how do you deliver information thoughtfully so that people learn new things and then can put those learnings to work is a pretty generic premise. And it's kind of been relegated to ed tech in the past and to learning management systems in companies, right? Now I think everybody's realizing there's value to that across everything you do if you can make people have access to the stuff that they can consume and then put to good use.
Yeah, as you say, it's kind of the deindustrialization of that education process, right? Putting it where it belongs. And I mean, we did a bunch of studies on the impact of educating the client as to product attributes in terms of their purchase behavior. And basically, if you educate a client, and with a complex configurable product, they're much more likely to buy more and buy a product line. And most product lines have a skew toward more profitability higher up on the product line. So the profit impact of educating.
So if you think about educating the prospective customer, there's the more purchasing that you just cited. You could also say there's fewer customer service demands. There's probably higher net promoter scores. Like the idea that you could be in just about any business saying that some form of imparting information thoughtfully is going to be to your strategic advantage. I think that's what's really interesting. And so I think part of what I'm seeing is some of these ed tech companies, they're doing it in the education domain, and people are taking what they're doing because they've optimized for it and saying, well, I want to bring that into my company. I want to bring this over because it's not just relegated. And the universities or educators are saying, look, we can bring some of our stuff into the businesses. Businesses can come back and reskill through universities and through community colleges. And it's not a hard line anymore.
Yeah, fascinating. As you say, it's universal. It's universal. It's widely applicable, right?
Yeah.
So I know we're coming up on time here. It's such a treat to talk to you. I miss talking to you more. The so one thing I would love, Ellen, if you're willing, is just to give us a couple minutes worth of, a lot of busy people and and professionals, and we've got this combination of virtual and physical now, and all of the stuff at a higher level than we used to. How do you think about relationships and networking and so forth, because they're so important, and I haven't seen anybody in the world better than you are at it, and I think you have both deep knowledge and empathy for professionals doing it. What are the kinds of things that you tell people, in terms of, other than, be friends with you? I mean, what do you tell, what do you tell people as they,
Yeah, I walk around saying, "Will you be my friend?" Uh, no. It's interesting. This is kind of like when we first started LinkedIn, you always say nobody likes to walk around saying I'm a good networker, because almost by definition, networkers don't say that, right? Like the people who are really good at it,
yeah,
it kind of is just things you do, and it helps a lot if you like doing it as opposed to having it just be prescriptive. But if I had to boil it down, I'll go back to that year that I chronicled my life. I mean, boy, do you ever become acutely aware that the one thing that is limited in life is time, right? And so even when I'm managing my relationships, a lot of my thinking comes back to be really respectful of time, understanding what you're asking of other people. If you want people to know that your relationship matters, allocate some time to it. And like, it doesn't mean that I have to set aside an hour to talk to you every 6 months. Otherwise, you think we're not friends. It's, as you've seen, sometimes there's automated services now, so it kind of diffused some of my value proposition. But like if I saw an article that I thought pertained to the business you just told me about yesterday that you were thinking of starting, or even 2, 3 months later, and I sent it to you and I said, given what you were telling me, this seems like it'd be relevant. I think those kind of things trigger, she's thinking of me. She understands what I'm thinking about, not what she's thinking about, right? And she took a moment to write something. I customize every introduction email I write. I say why I thought to put people in touch. And yes, it takes me longer. It means I don't get them out sometimes for a day or two because I got to write them versus Ellen meet John, John meet Ellen, which is a very standard introduction. Because I always figure if people see that I invested in time in it, then I really think it's worth the time. Like I've had people send those emails, Ellen meet John, John meet Ellen, and I'll write the person who did the introduction. I go, who is this? Do you know them? Did you go to school with them? Were you their boss? Do you like their business? Like what is? And they're like, oh no, he just wrote me saying he wanted to meet you. That's actually the opposite, which is so disrespectful of somebody's time, not in like the sense that I say it's a bad person, but boy, are you killing the opportunity to really be thoughtful. And I think it's kind of mostly subconscious, but it pays off in spades. And so even when you're asking people to do something for you, I'm very careful. I'll call and go, look, haven't caught up in a long time, but what made me think of you is I have a favor to ask. Because we all know there's people that call up and you talk for half an hour, but they're going to ask you something before you hang up, but they pretend that they're going through the. I'm like, just call it what it is, and say I need a favor, but I also do miss catching up. I also try to make it as easy as possible for somebody to do something if you need it. Right. Like if you want to meet with somebody, I've offered people to give them rides to the airport. I'll do, whatever, you're captive in a car anyways. I'll drive you. Right. And then LinkedIn in our design principles, you look at stuff like if I wanted you to introduce me to someone, I'm asked to write what I want. I'm asked to write to you, John, and tell you, remember we talked, you said you'd introduce me. So I write what I want. So you don't have to come up with like Ellen's looking for this introduction to you. And my bio is already on LinkedIn. So you, the guy who has to do something, is as painfully easy as possible. You can just connect and maybe go, hey, Ellen's worth the conversation. And you just hit forward. So putting the burden on the right people, realizing you're asking people for time. And then the one that I've gotten more sensitive to recently is, it's a little contradictory of this time claim, is respect people for the expertise and the decades of perspective that they've accumulated. Because just because it took me 1 minute to come up with an idea doesn't mean that it's only worth 1 minute of my hourly rate. And so a lot of times, I think people think they can just do something quick with you and they don't recognize the value. And so just being very appreciative of what's coming as opposed to just being very transactional.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the one counter to the time piece, which is, if somebody weighs in once for 5 minutes on my business plan when I'm an entrepreneur and it changes the whole way I think about my business,
Exactly.
that's phenomenally valuable, and showing that kind of appreciation and realizing that value is key.
Well, my sculpture teacher in high school was a guy named Henry Cabot Lyford, and Cabot, he went by Cabot. And Cabot used to get really mad when he did watercolors among other things, and they'd say, "How long did it take you to do that?" And he said, "I finally come up with an answer I like, which is 20 minutes and 20 years."
Yeah, I'll close on a perfect example I'm working on today after I get off this podcast. I have a friend who's in venture capital, and she sent a deal to me. It was too early stage for her, but she said, "I thought of you. Like, I thought you'd like this." And that deal just got acquired. That company just got acquired in December, January. And I want to, I'll say who it is. She's fantastic, Katie Stanton. And this, she had sourced me this deal. I don't even know if she remembers she sent them my way. She just told the entrepreneur, "This is something Ellen is really interested in."
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to figure out how to send her a gift, because remembering who helped at critical points. There's all kinds of things that had to happen afterwards, but remembering people who were instrumental is a phenomenal way of saying that you actually care about your network.
That's neat. Well, that is a great place to end. Ellen, thank you, in terms of taking the time. And I really appreciate the favor you've done for us here. So,
Oh, such a pleasure. No, it's great. And I love what you guys are doing. Every time you hear about Manifold and how you're going about it, you're the embodiment of a lot of the stuff I care about. So that's great to be involved.
well, thanks. I appreciate it. Awesome. Well, I'm going to tell folks about what's a quick rest of the story and what's next week. And apologies that we were a minute over. Thanks, Ellen. So in terms of what I'd like to do is just do a quick rest of the story. There's a guy, actually, when I was teaching at Harvard Business School, I used to walk past this portrait every time I went to class. This is a picture of General Georges Doriot, and Georges Doriot was one of the very first venture capitalists at a place called American Research and Development out of Boston, and he used to send his teams out to different companies in the 128 Boston area, when that's where the computer revolution was in this country. And anyway, he came to my dad's business, which was in fact similar at the time, and my dad basically sent him home packing. And I always wondered what would happen if my dad had engaged with Doriot and taken his money and so forth. One of his companies was Digital Equipment Corporation. So I hope you think of what Ellen said, not the way my dad did, but take the advice and work with it. You can use any of this material that we've talked about in an open source manner. Please do just reference where you got it, and happy to talk to you more about the topics. Just want to set up next month, which is another dear friend, Bill Fandrich. He's Chief Information Officer at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, and he's a real innovator. He was at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts for many years, and is one of those combination of people who really knows how to get the business of being a technologist done, but at the same time really pushes forward the organization as part of the leadership team there. And they're doing some really interesting, innovative, important things. And Ellen and I were talking about before we began here, the whole area of healthcare. There's literally trillions of dollars moving around due to new models, technology, and caring. So with that, it's delightful to have you all here. I hope you can make it next month. Again, one last time, Ellen, thank you so much for being a part of this. And I hope this helps you all innovate and grow your organizations.